right, welcome back once again to Rhythms of Grace. My name's Nate. I'm the executive pastor at Grace Church, and I'm here with Sung, who's the lead pastor of Grace Church. And we are in a series where we're talking about the book of Job, because our sermon series across all of our locations is on the book of Job, but we've found that there's just too much there to fit week by week into a sermon that's 20, 30, in some cases 45 minutes long. There just isn't space to put everything.
Right.
But it's important. It feels valuable, right?
It does. And that's not just with the book of Job. Just about, every sermon we talk through, there's just never enough time.
Yeah.
And we often talk about leaving things on the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
And like films,
Yeah.
right? There's always things being cut.
Yeah, and I think the book of Job also it's particularly difficult to cover everything because it's a little bit like a piece of literature. I mean, if you think about, if you read a novel or something like that, there's so much to talk about in terms of motivations of characters and all these, and that Job has all of those things. Yeah. And so while if you remember back to high school or college where you would take a semester to like read a book, we only have a couple weeks to talk about something that really has as much sort of depth and breadth, that we could talk about.
Yeah.
So this week, we in the sermon, we're talking about Job's friends, but a very important character is left out of the story that makes an appearance. Who are we talking about?
So Job's wife enters the picture for the first and only time in the entire book. Now, she is famous for being this cruel and unsympathetic partner. Yeah. In fact, when Job is afflicted, and we don't really cover this in the sermon, he's afflicted with all these sores and just and it says in Job chapter 2, it says he takes a piece of broken pottery and he starts scraping himself.
Oh, man.
As he's sitting in the ashes. And then his wife, and this is what she's known for, his wife says to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die."
Wow. Like telling your spouse just to just die already. That is not a very sympathetic.
No, it's not. And this isn't a suggestion. It's a command.
Yeah.
She's like, hey, curse God, get it over with. Like, just let go of him because he's not done right by you, and just die already.
Wow.
But before we criticize her, let's remember that everything that Job has lost, she has lost too. She lost everything, just like Job did, in one single day, in one moment in time. Yeah. And so, again, just to put some a lens of compassion on her, she's not just this violent, kind of cruel person. The way she responds is very different from Job, but she has gone through great tragedy.
Yeah, and we're essentially seeing her at her absolute worst.
Yes.
And thank goodness that we are not our absolute worst. Like, our absolute worst does not define us, right? I mean, thank goodness. But that's kind of that's the very, very small snapshot we see of her. It's so helpful to remember that she is suffering every bit as much as Job is. She lost all of her children. She lost everything that she had known. And it lets us see her through a lens of compassion.
Yeah, and that also highlights sometimes the wrong ways that we approach adversity, because what she is doing right now is she's actually seeing Job's pain in light of her pain.
Yeah.
I mean, in one sense, like, they're suffering together,
Yep.
but in another sense, the very thing that could bring them closer together is actually driving them apart at this point.
Yeah.
And so I think we can tend to do that too. That is the great temptation, to blame the one who is suffering for bringing suffering upon us.
Well, and I think that's where it's different to be a spouse or have it be a significant, call it a romantic partnership. That's different than Job's friends, for example. I mean, Job's friends, it's amazing because they came and they wept and sat with him for a week, right? That's extraordinary. But honestly, they could have left at any time.
Right.
Like, what option did Job's wife have?
Right.
She, especially kind of in that sort of time period, she was stuck with him, essentially. So
and maybe that's why she's like, just die already.
Right? Like, I want to marry your brother. But I can think of that in my own life, where if my wife is suffering, it's hard not to feel how that impacts me.
Right.
And to kind of say, like, can you just pull yourself together? You're making my life, like, really difficult right now.
Inconvenient.
Yeah, right. And it's, again, for me, that allows a frame of compassion with which to see her, because I do the same thing. Now, I've never lost as much as they have lost, but even in the small ways, I can relate to that sort of mindset.
Right. Yeah. And so she can't understand why Job is still holding on to his integrity. And so when she says like that, she's like, why are you still maintaining your integrity? The implication is that she has completely abandoned hers. She's saying, look, you've been faithful to God, and this is what you get from being blameless and upright. And those are the two words that's used to describe Job. This is what you get from God. And so she's just like, just curse him. Why do you maintain your integrity? Just get it over with.
Wow.
And so I think that's really pretty cruel.
It is, and I think we can look at the character of Job's wife and essentially acknowledge, like, she pretty much does everything wrong. Like, when someone you love is suffering, or when you are suffering as she is, in some ways she's sort of like the counterbalance to Job, who does everything right in the midst of suffering. But there are some things that she does wrong that, if we look at the opposite, I think can help us frame how we should, call it, co-suffer, or how we should engage with a very, very intimate relationship with someone who's suffering. And one of the things that she does wrong, you just mentioned, which is she's telling Job, like, abandon your integrity. You know, like, like, it'll be easier for you to just abandon your integrity. And if you're suffering, and someone you love is suffering, if you're co-suffering together, the right thing to do is to continue to encourage each other,
right,
to maintain your integrity, to kind of like, we have to hold on to what we know to be true.
Right.
Yeah.
So what ways have you co-suffered? Or has Amy co-suffered with you?
Yeah, I've caused a lot of suffering.
So have I.
I know, right? Yeah, you know, I think... it's honestly, sometimes it's painful for me to remember. One of the things that I am most aware of is that when I worked as a stockbroker for 10 years, was really miserable. I was really miserable. And I knew that I was miserable, but what really brought it to a point was after I left that job, we had a friend over for dinner. We were all gathered around the table, and my son, who was about 10 at the time, said to this person, you know, my dad's happy for the first time in 10 years. And I realized that, like, my suffering wasn't just my own, but that my children and my wife were living in a house with someone who was perpetually unhappy and anxious and angry and disappointed. And the way that my wife co-suffered with me was really a model of grace. You know, she has always been understanding, but she's also very, very willing to sort of call me on, you know, she had been telling me to quit that job for years, right? But she really did model a gracious sort of perspective.
Yeah. My wife, whose name is also Amy.
Oh, nice.
Right.
That's not confusing. Amy Kimball.
No. Same thing. Very long suffering. You know, and I'll use an example of me, of a bad example.
Okay.
I can relate to Job's wife in a very, very small way, again, because this is nowhere near what she had suffered. Well, and let's go to health issues. You know, for years and years, especially after the kids were born, Amy started to experience some health symptoms. Mm-hmm. And I remember she was exploring so many different things and looking into, and this, I mean, it's all over the place now, but this was like years ago when it was still kind of fringe, like she was exploring gluten-free options. And I remember being like, what?
Why can't I have a sandwich?
Yeah, or like, why can't you eat a sandwich?
Yeah.
And then she was buying everything organic, and again, like that is all over the place now. But this was so rare back in the day, and all I could think of is like, oh my goodness, like organic produce is so much more.
It is.
Like, you know, if I just got like just 2% milk, it'd be like $2.
Yeah.
We're paying $6 to get like,
Yeah.
And so like, and there was that sense of like, again, like your health issues, like I was seeing the inconvenience from the lens of how she was affecting me.
Yeah.
And not only that, but and the crazy thing is like she grew up always taking care of her body really well and her health, and I didn't. And yet here she was feeling the fragility of her body and her health, and I just couldn't understand it.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, this is like, we've been married 20 years, and like over the years, because of her patience and kindness, I've actually come around.
Really?
And now that I've gotten older too, like even just a couple of weeks ago, I was like, hey, Aim, I just realized this, I'm learning this. And she's like, oh yeah, I've known that.
And honestly, Sung, she probably told you that.
She did. She
knew it.
has.
I knew it.
And she actually says too, she'll be like, I was talking to somebody at church and they told me this, and I was like, oh my goodness. And she's like, Sung, I've been telling you that for 5 years now.
Oh, jeez. So, so examples of co-suffering, but I want to kind of come back to the point where Job's wife tells him to abandon his integrity. And really, like in the example that you give, like the right thing to do is to simply say, like, hey, like I'm gonna, like, don't stop trying.
Yeah.
Don't stop trying. I'm gonna walk with you through this. I want you to keep searching. I'm on board. That's really the right way to navigate, to co-suffer with someone on that point.
It is, and again, now that we've, can I throw Job's wife under the bus now?
Yes, let's do it. Sorry, Job's wife.
Not like our wives.
No.
Oh, no. But, she actually voices and verbalizes the great temptation that Job feels, which is to compromise his faith in order to ease his burden.
Yeah.
And so when things get hard, I think we are tempted to do the same too, to just compromise our faith and just say, it's okay if I loosen up here. God loves me. He's merciful. He'll forgive me just to make my life easier.
Yeah.
Even though deep down inside we know it's displeasing to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then Job's response to his wife is really a rebuke. He says this. He says, "Shall we receive good from God and not adversity?" And basically he's saying, look, whatever good that has been given to me is not owed to me.
Yeah.
In fact, everything that has been given to me has been graciously bestowed to me.
Yeah.
And that attitude of entitlement versus humility,
Yeah.
Again, that runs rampant in our lives, in our kids' lives, in all of society.
Yeah.
And I think that's a divide we see here too. Like Job is just like, hey, everything I have is a gift from God. I don't deserve anything.
Yeah.
And Job's wife, it's like, look, you've taken all the good. Like, well, she doesn't say this, but in some ways she does. It's like, I'm entitled to all of these luxuries in life.
Yeah. That is another example for me of how to do things wrong, and then we can talk about the right way to do things, which is she's really coming at their suffering from a really different perspective than Job is. She has kind of, like you said, a layer of expectation and entitlement. But I can say that not having the same sort of framework of expectations, there's nothing that will dissolve an intimate relationship faster in some ways, misaligned expectations.
Yeah.
So I think we can take from that the right thing to do when someone you deeply love is suffering, or when you're co-suffering together, is that getting on the same page about kind of, this is how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to think about this. This is the framework that we're going to make our decisions on, and this is what we're going to believe to be true. That's so critical.
It is.
Your relationship almost, this is extreme, but almost can't survive without that,
I think it's really important, and that's not just with suffering. Having a common framework and alignment in that is so important in so many different areas, whether it's parenting, whether it's
that's a good one.
faith.
Yep.
I mean, those things can really divide a marriage and make like just have a marriage wither away.
Yeah.
Not only that, but also like how you deal with money, how you spend it, how much you save, all of those things. I mean, it's so important.
Yeah, we now that my wife and I are a little bit older and our kids are teenagers, we often have young parents come to us and say, "Hey, like, how did you raise you? Give us some advice." And one of the main things that I say is that you need to be on the same page. It actually doesn't matter if you find yourself to be, well, again, I'm speaking in extremes, but it matters less about whether you're a very liberal parent or a very authoritarian parent. What matters more than that, where you find yourself on that spectrum, is if you and your spouse are in the same spot. Nothing will dissolve a family relationship and cause difficulty with children more than if you have a very liberal parent and a very sort of authoritarian parent. Man, kids learn how to play off those two extremes by like 18 months, literally. So it's finding, not just in suffering, but in everything, finding sort of, maybe it's a compromise, but coming to agreement about saying this is how we're going to do this. And my wife and I have done that with parenting is a great example, where we decided, look, this is the line we're going to draw. It's not quite where you want it. It's not quite where I want it, but we can agree that this is where we're going to start holding the line.
Yeah, and especially in marriage, right? This goes back to your vows. For young couples and older couples, you make a vow that in sickness and in health. And I think sometimes we just think, oh, health and wealth is what we look forward to in marriage, and we forget sometimes, well, sickness does come upon us. Maybe not to the extreme as Job, but it does. And poverty comes upon us. And so for those of you who are looking to get married or wanting to get married, man, that's so important to remember, having a common framework, because Job, what we see is he pledges his allegiance to God regardless of the circumstance. And that's basically what you're doing when you're making that vow to each other, but you're making it to God too. Hey, God, I vow that I will walk with this person no matter what the circumstance.
So, I mean, to take it out of the arena of sort of spousal relationships, I actually had an experience of this with you. I mean, I think people are probably aware that you and I, maybe they're not, we work together more closely than almost anybody else. I mean, like, there is very little that we do individually when it comes to decision making or anything like that. So
in our household, you're my other wife.
Hooray.
Or should I be the wife?
Moving on. Let's not try to figure out which one of us is the wife in the relationship. But so our intimacy is important.
It is.
And one of the things that happened when we were in a particularly sort of stormy season was that I was praying about it, and I felt like the truth that God sort of spoke into my heart was that because what I was doing is I was seeing you as the problem. For if Sung would just this, if Sung would just that, if Sung would just this, right? And what the truth that God spoke into my heart was that the problem is the problem. Sung is not the problem. Nate is not the problem. Like, it's true we're contributing, but the problem is the problem. And I think having that mindset, sort of creating a common framework for going forward, saying let's talk about what the problem is, and then what it lets you do is it lets you sort of get around to the same side, and you're not seeing the other person through the lens of the issue, but you're kind of on the same side combating the problem. And I think the same is true in suffering. If you can create a common framework, you move yourself around to the same side, and you can actually work together to combat whether it's despondence, despair, depression, suffering, all of those things. But you have to remember that the other person is not the one that's making your life full of suffering. The other, and there's unhealthy relationships where that is true. I'm not talking about that. But to get yourself on the same side and to work towards a common framework. So critical.
It is. And I think especially in marriage too, like I often tell myself, like the way I'm seeing the problem is the problem.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's a good one too.
Right.
Yeah.
Because like I'm seeing it in a very myopic kind of way, kind of pointing fingers
Yeah.
and going, okay, the way I'm seeing that, that's the problem.
Yep.
And especially, for like that difference of perspective is the difference between couples and going back into the marriage relationship. I mean, I've seen couples go through, horrific things.
Yeah.
Adultery, unfaithfulness, bankruptcy, the loss of a child, and even
Deep financial deception.
Yeah.
I know someone who literally racked up like $100,000 in debt without telling their spouse,
And I've seen marriages and relationships come out of that stronger.
Absolutely.
And there's a part of me that Amy and I talk about this too. Like sometimes, like we're like, I don't really understand. It's so hard to wrap our minds around. Like, how do you come out of like adultery?
Yeah.
Stronger. Yeah. That just seems so heart-wrenching.
It does. But it also recalls to mind a lot of the arguments or disagreements or, intense conversations you and I had. At the end of it, we ended every single one by saying like, look, this is worth it. I'm committed to this.
Right.
I believe that this is going to make our working relationship and the church stronger. We're just going to keep pushing through. And that's in some ways, I think that's the difference between success and failure, which is like, you just have to have an attitude of we're not going to quit. Yeah. We're not going to quit. And this actually kind of ties into the second point that we addressed, and I just wanted to come back to really briefly, which is that there's an encouragement for the other person to maintain their integrity. And, Job's wife, again, says, just curse God and die. But in the midst of those difficult times, to be able to say, we're committed to this, we're together, like the only way through this is through it. It's like that. Do you remember that bear story? We're going on a bear hunt. No. Okay. Well, you can't go over it, can't go under it. Guess we'll have to go through it. Sorry. That's for all of the toddlers that listen to the podcast. They'll know what I'm talking about. But yeah, there's a reestablishment of integrity and encouragement to one another. Yeah. For me, it begs the question: how do we do that well? How when you are suffering or when you are hurting, and if maybe you don't like your spouse or your significant other very much because of who they are in suffering, how do we find a place of encouragement, or how do we find a place of affirmation of integrity and faith and doing the right thing?
I know for me, because I will hear this oftentimes from people who come to me for especially relationship or marriage counseling, especially when it's on the brink of divorce. And it's really common for one party to say, well, I would act this way if they would act this way. Yeah. And the thing I often tell them, and because it's been so true in my life, is like, hey, think of your relationship as like a mathematical formula. If you change one variable, because the complaint is, why should I change? They're not going to change.
Yeah, very common.
But I often say, like, or a chemical formula. You change one variable in that whole formula, the outcome is completely different. You get something else completely. And so focus less on you trying to control the other person and making them act a certain way, and focus more on how you're responding. Because if you change you, that person may or may not change. Yeah. And that's not you don't base whether you're going to change your behavior and your attitude based on whether they're going to change.
Yeah.
But when you do that, oftentimes what happens is when you dive in without that expectation, that changes the outcome more often than not.
I mean, a practical example of that is that my wife is the living embodiment of the verse that says a soft answer turns away wrath. And when I am starting to get worked up, she's not trying to fix me in that moment. She's not trying to remind me of my sort of integrity or faith or the right thing to do, but she will always act with integrity and say something that is compassionate and understanding, or she'll be the first to apologize. And that changes the entire situational dynamic, right? Like, how can I continue to be upset when she's just saying, I understand this is really frustrating for you. I can see that. I want to help you feel better. Like, what can you do? No, I don't want you to make it better. I want you to fight with me. Right?
You're being too kind and patient.
Right. It just all starts to dissolve. So it's a good reminder that in some ways encouraging integrity in someone else begins with maintaining integrity in yourself. And how different would Job's wife's interaction with him have been if she had not abandoned her integrity in the first place?
Yeah. I think one thing that means for us when it comes to our relationship with God is, I think it's really easy. For example, when you get a raise at work or you're promoted and your health is, you get a clean bill of health and your relationship and your marriage is going well. If you're attending church in person or even at home, you're just kind of like, yeah, praise God. You're lifting your hands and it's just easy to praise God. But the question is, what happens when bad things happen?
Yeah.
You lose your job. You hear bad news about your health or a family member's health. There's broken relationship. It's really easy. I mean, it's really easy at that point to be like, man, God is distant. He doesn't love me. He's not worthy of my praise. But I think integrity of faith is also like trusting in God, not based on our circumstances. And again, this is where the value of friendship is, which is what we talked about this past week. Like modeling the kind of friendship that is forged in the fire, in the crucible, right? Actually, to be honest, when I was talking about that too, in the sermon, you were one of the people I thought of when it said friendship is forged through hardship and in the crucible and in the fire. Yeah. And I was just like, oh yeah, it's not just through good times. We've laughed a lot. Sure. We've had good times together, but we've navigated some hard things too. Yeah. And at the end of the day, you're like, man, those are the people that you've been through, like to hell and back.
Yeah, relational boot camp, kind of like it's not.
Yeah. And those are the relationships, you're like, yeah, you don't want to lose because you've been through so much together. Yeah. And the thing here, in contrast, at the end of this chapter, Job is totally alone, right? His wife has said, hey, you curse God and die. This is before, his friends will abandon him. And it's such a sad picture that he's just sitting in an ash heap outside the city.
Oh, man.
Because in fact, he couldn't stay home. He couldn't even stay inside the city because Mosaic law said, hey, if you suffered all these boils and sores, you're unclean. Yeah. You have to isolate yourself. And so he's totally alone. And so, man, one of the best things you could do in terms of helping you to maintain your integrity and your faith in God is to surround yourself with people who will just cheer you on. Yeah. Like that verse that I talked about in Proverbs, somebody who sticks closer to you than a brother or a sister. Yeah. And who will always encourage you, trust God, hold your integrity. Yeah. And you do that for each other because there are seasons when one of you will fall and the other, is holding the other person up. So again, that's so key. Yeah.
Well, if you didn't get a chance to listen to the most recent sermon from Sung, you can find it on our website, gracechurch.city. And it talks about Job's friends and how the right things they do in engaging with Job's suffering. We're out of honestly, I feel like we're just scratching the surface, but we're out of time on this topic already. So I hope you'll join us again next week as we do. Do you know what we're going to talk about next week?
Chapter 3.
Okay.
That's Job just curses the day that he's born.
Okay. All right. Well, everybody wants to tune in for that one. We hope to see you here next week. Thanks, everybody.